Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the ALNAP webinar on Breaking the Mould, Alternative Approaches to M&E for Humanitarian Action. This webinar is the culmination of almost a year's research and engagement that we've undertaken at ALNAP. So personally, I'm quite excited to launch the webinar, to share some of the findings and to discuss some of the examples that we've got from the ALNAP community. So it should be a good hour and a half. Just to give you a bit of an overview, our work looked into a range of different innovative approaches to M&E in the humanitarian sector. We investigated 3 different lines of thinking, each of which have been challenging traditional approaches to M&E in the humanitarian sector for some time. So that goes from adaptive program teams asking for greater flexibility in monitoring and evaluation systems, through to project level decision makers asking for continuous data flows that can feed into iterative learning cycles. And in addition to both of those points, there's also the need that was expressed for M&E systems to improve their capacity to integrate the multiple and often conflicting views of people living through crisis. Each of those lines of thought ask us to fundamentally challenge the way that we're doing M&E in the sector. So questions like, as humanitarian agencies become more adaptive to change, how can any M&E system that's based on a fixed log frame keep up? Or as humanitarians increasingly target continuous learning over multi-annual programs, how can an M&E system developed for short-term project cycles provide useful input? Or also, as humanitarians seek to integrate the views of different affected population groups, how can M&E systems get better at exploring tensions and contradictions about the value of a project, program, or initiative? So lots of big questions behind this work. And those questions drove our search for new ways of doing M&E. We were looking primarily outside of the humanitarian sector for inspiration on that. And we found a whole collection of tools and approaches that, if applied well, could theoretically enhance innovation inside the humanitarian M&E community. All the findings from that are available in our Breaking the Mould report, which is available on the ALNAP website. And I'm going to run through a rough outline of that report in a moment. But first of all, I want to explain the agenda of the webinar, what we're doing here, and to introduce our fantastic co-presenters. So firstly, we have Victoria Palmer from Care Canada, who will be sharing a really interesting example of M&E called the rolling profiles. I'm quite excited to have her with us to explain this. They've been trialing that approach for a short period of time in various development contexts, so there's lots for us to learn from that. And then secondly, we've got Lydia Palmer from Tear Fund. She'll be telling us all about their light wheel method for collecting holistic information about the lives of people living through crisis. So again, some really interesting stuff that I think is quite pertinent to the topics that we have in the Breaking the Mould paper. I'll be passing the mic to Victoria and Lydia in a bit. But first, as I said, let me just walk through the agenda for the webinar. So we're going to start with a run through of the Breaking the Mould paper, expanding the 3 major arguments for innovation in M&E systems that we found there. I'll also touch briefly on some of the examples of systems that we found responding to those arguments, so core case examples. But I'm going to keep it quite brief. I would encourage all of you who are interested to download the report if you want more depth on the approaches, because I think it's quite technical, and to be honest, I think you'd have to spend some time reading the documentation rather than just having it read out in a webinar. So I'll keep it brief when I'm looking at the in-depth approaches. And then around about 2:15, or maybe more like 2:20, I'll hand over to Victoria for her example of CARE's rolling profiles methodology. She's going to tell us a little bit about the nuts and the bolts of that approach and some considerations for what it brings that other approaches don't necessarily do. And then after Victoria, I'll hand over to Lydia for the second example, Tear Fund's light wheel. And that's an approach that provides a broad-based analytical framework for tracking people's needs over time. After all the presentations, we'll have a quick discussion between the 3 of us, reflecting on the biggest learning that we've taken from our experiences and what we see as the biggest challenges for applying these tools in humanitarian contexts. And at that point, we'll open it up for questions. So that's the rough agenda for the webinar. So I think without any further ado, we can move on to the Breaking the Mould report. So just to give everybody a little bit of context, I want to explain why we were talking about change. What's led us to think about innovation in M&E for humanitarian action? Essentially, there's a few arguments there. The first point is that we've seen successively, we've seen calls and complaints almost that we have limited use of M&E information for ongoing decision making and learning. I hesitate when I say that because I think in the sector there are some fantastic examples of monitoring and evaluation systems feeding into decision making and learning. But nevertheless, I think it's fair to say that when you look at the State of the Humanitarian System report that ALNAP produces every 3 years, we often touch upon the limited use and uptake of findings from monitoring and evaluation tools. And when you look at the scoping paper that ALNAP published in 2017, we reviewed the approaches to monitoring across the ALNAP membership, and we found consistently that there was a preference for the use of monitoring information to be used for donor accountability as opposed to project learning. So this is a repeated call. I think it's something we've heard before, and we're hearing it again now. The second point is that we often hear about a divide between formal and informal learning systems. So on the one hand, you have quite formalized monitoring and evaluation tools that will provide reporting outputs that are then intended to be used to encourage evidence-based decision making. On the other hand, you have the informal learning and the tacit knowledge that we all know exists in the humanitarian sector. And I think the divide between those formal and informal systems is something that we've seen successively, people asking if we can help to bridge that divide by considering how we design our M&E tools and how usable they are and how they feed into decision making in a more realistic manner. And then lastly, we've got growing calls for adaptive monitoring and evaluation systems. So here we're talking about increasing the flexibility of our M&E tools so that they can cope with project change during implementation. We're also talking about increasing the speed of output so that we can feed into rapid decision-making cycles, particularly important in sudden onset emergencies. And then we're also talking about embedding M&E systems within project teams so that they can support continuous experimentation and change, which is what's needed if you want to take adaptive programming seriously. In a sense, I don't think there's anything new on that slide. I think these are calls that we've heard before. The point is that it's the accumulation of these different arguments that are coming together that have led us to ask ourselves, okay, it's 2019, what innovations can we have in M&E systems that can really help us to tackle those challenges? So that's what led us to do the paper. Essentially, we were just looking to share some of the learning from innovative M&E tools that can increase the usability of monitoring and evaluation for ongoing decision-making and learning. And we did that by firstly unpacking the different arguments for innovation. Secondly, looking at a selection of innovative approaches that respond to those arguments. And then lastly, considering some of the opportunities and challenges that arise when you consider the question of how can we apply these tools in humanitarian settings. In terms of methodology, I'm really not going to bore you guys with this, but essentially what we did is we reviewed a wide range of literature. We looked at meal policies and frameworks of our ALNAP members. We looked at evaluation theory and practice from outside the humanitarian sector. And we did a round of key informant interviews. What we fed all that together into was a study matrix that looked for examples of non-traditional monitoring and evaluation approaches drawn from humanitarian, but primarily from development sector and social innovation within Western countries. We also look for lessons learned for each approach from monitoring and evaluation teams, commissioners, and users. So we're looking at the lessons that could be learned from those approaches and applying them to the different stakeholders in the M&E system. And then lastly, we were looking for challenges and opportunities for application within the humanitarian sector. So that's broadly speaking what we did and how we did it. If we look now quickly at the findings, the first point is that we saw a range of different arguments for innovation. So on the screen there, you can see 3 arguments, one from timing, one from flexibility, and one from perspectives. If we just start with timing, what we were seeing is the argument that we're increasingly understanding that programming doesn't take place in a kind of simplistic program cycle manner. So we don't just go from program design through to implementation, through to monitoring evaluation, through to redesign. In fact, what we see is that there's multiple decision points throughout project implementation, and those decisions happen at different frequencies. And so if you take that seriously and you want M&E to feed into that stuff, then there are a bunch of requirements that fall out of it. The best way to cluster those requirements is to talk about this concept of going beyond real time. So rather than just speeding up or changing the point at which M&E takes place, we're talking about moving beyond delivering discrete packages of information to decision makers, and rather providing a continuous data flow that covers both monitoring, the tracking of what's happening, and also evaluation, assessments of its worth. But to have that stuff available in a continuous way so that it can encourage ongoing decision making. The second argument for innovation is that the one that comes from flexibility. So understanding now that projects change as contexts evolve, and understanding that projects change as our knowledge base evolves, as we come to understand what works and what doesn't, then we need to accept that programming itself will have to become flexible and more adaptive in the future. If that's to happen, there's been a series of calls over the last 2-3 years for M&E systems to respond to that. So that means responding to adaptation. So here we're talking about conducting M&E in a situation where the original terms of reference or the original theory of change for the program no longer really strictly applies. So how can M&E systems have something useful to say there? Secondly, supporting that adaptation. So as I mentioned with timing, if you're able to provide data and assessment that is available continuously and can support ongoing decision making, then you can also support the kind of adaptive thinking processes that we're talking about here. So if program teams need to be constantly testing and retesting their assumptions, essentially experimenting rather than just implementing, then really what we need is an M&E system that can actually feed into that in a supportive way. And the last point on flexibility is that even if that's achievable, we also need to be able to evaluate adaptation. So to what degree can M&E systems stand back and ask critically the degree to which an adaptive approach improves the effectiveness or the relevance of humanitarian action? So there's a lot to ask from the flexibility argument, but it's worth crystallizing those different constraints and different requirements. And then on on perspectives, there's a third line of argument here that came up in our round of interviews, and it came up in the literature review. And this was the argument that we're increasingly aware now that we need to be open to locally led solutions. We need to be humble about understanding that when we start doing a project, we don't necessarily know exactly what's going to lead to the best solution. And so programs become more adaptive as they accept that and as they allow themselves to change and adapt as the program goes. The M&E requirements for that are to go a little bit beyond the participatory dialogue that I think we've had for a good decade now in the evaluations community, for sure. So instead of just asking how we make sure that we gather the views of affected people, we also need to be looking at how we can really probe and analyze the different perspectives that exist on the worth and the effectiveness of a program. How do we explore the different boundaries? Because different people within different stakeholder groups will perceive the project as having different boundaries and beginning and ending at different places. So really what we're asking for here is an M&E system that's able to explore that stuff in a meaningful way. So having unpacked the arguments for innovation, it's worth looking at what innovation can look like. So here we break those down by the three arguments. So we looked at examples of innovation that respond to the timing argument. And I think what we're talking about there is multi-year and embedded evaluation. So multi-year being the creation of 2, 3, sometimes 5-year evidence windows that will provide evaluation, assessment, and monitoring information to support repeated reflection points over that larger cycle. So we're kind of elongating the evidence window. But we also looked at embedding evaluation teams, which in a sense is almost the opposite. It's aligning the delivery of the evaluation output with decision making by embedding that team alongside project teams. So it's a little bit like having your meal team in a country office, but on steroids. So we might be embedding individual evaluators alongside project makers in their weekly meetings to encourage use of evaluation evidence in weekly and daily decision making. So there's one example there that I won't dwell on too much, but it's worth looking at in the paper. It's called the Zambia Accountability Program. And there they set up the M&E system to run side by side with the project team. And they provided quite a rich ongoing data stream for the project managers. And they had beyond the formal reporting mechanism, which they did have, but they also provided regular informal reflection points. So the M&E team were there, available and regularly discussing and critically engaging with the project team on a weekly basis. So that's something that really enhanced the degree to which evaluation was taken into account on a regular basis. There's lots of challenges there. I think the biggest ones are, when looking to apply this in the humanitarian sector, the short project cycles that we still see in the sector. So it's quite hard to do multi-year evidence windows if you have short 6 to 9 month project contracts. Likewise, meeting saturation. If we're serious about embedding evaluation teams, and that means increasing the meeting burden, essentially asking difficult questions on a weekly basis. Of course, this is something that people are already used to, but we need to be aware that adding an additional burden to this can be problematic. The next point I would like to look at is the examples that came from flexibility. So here we were looking at developmental evaluation, an approach designed by Michael Quinn Patton quite a long time ago now, but spoken about in great detail over the last 10 years. And so we're talking about embedding an evaluator again for the entire project cycle, and documenting decisions that are made in real time, and that's quite a critical element. It's that use of structuring the data management that really helps to feed evaluative thinking into project meetings. So the evaluator will be there embedded, but they will be collecting and collating all of the information that's made, all the information that's taken, and all of the decisions that are made. So the example that we have in the report there is called the home study, which again I would encourage you to take a look at. It's not from the development or humanitarian sectors. It's from an example in Australia where they were trying to change home-based care for chronic diseases amongst marginalized populations. A really interesting project and a very interesting study, because in this case the M&E team did quite significant work to systemize that data management aspect of the project's work. And they used that to then support quite iterative changes in the delivery model. Some of the examples in the paper are worth looking at, but essentially it enabled them to change the way that they targeted and that they made the project appropriate to the particular target group that they were working with. Challenges around that are, again, time and money. So that's something that if you're talking about embedding an evaluator full-time over the whole project cycle, that's quite expensive, but also organizational culture. I think this is something that we discuss quite a lot, and we're well aware of the need to ensure that our organizations are open to evidence, whether challenging or otherwise. But if you're doing this in an embedded way, and if you're really using a developmental evaluative approach, then it really asks a lot of that organizational culture to make sure at the micro level we're happy testing and retesting our assumptions about the value of what we're doing. And the last point then is on perspectives. So we saw some examples that were specifically targeted at increasing the ability of M&E systems to integrate multiple and sometimes conflicting perspectives from the beneficiaries of aid or from people living through crisis. So some of this stuff is coming from the systems and complexity sensitive methodology. The kinds of things I'm talking about, you can see on the screen there are lists that I think looks a bit sci-fi. So we're talking about systems mapping, systems dynamics, critical systems heuristics, social network analysis, and agent-based modeling. It really sounds futuristic. We saw some examples of each of those, and they're listed in the report, but to take just one of them, there's a neat example of critical systems heuristics that took place almost a decade ago now, where there was an HIV/AIDS reduction program in West Africa, and the evaluation team used an analytical framework to bring up questions and findings that they really wouldn't have come across in a traditional framework. So essentially they were just framing their evaluative inquiry around those 4 issues you can see on the screen: motivation of all the actors, the donors, the project teams, and the target groups; the power relationships between each of those groups; the expertise and where it came from, and what the accreditation of it was, and how we understood expertise in this system; and then the legitimacy point, how it was understood and how it was perceived, the legitimacy of each of the decision makers in question. That framework allowed the evaluators to identify some problems that they perhaps wouldn't have without it. So in this case, they looked at the exclusion of street sex workers as a target group in this HIV/AIDS reduction program. It highlighted the implications of that exclusion, and it sort of sought to encourage the program team to change the targeting approach on that basis. They also identified a power dynamic between the headquarters and the field teams that, again, they might not have been able to crystallize in such a neat way without that analytical framework. So again, there are challenges to doing this stuff. The sci-fi list on the screen there is deeply abstract. There are huge skill sets required. If you want to do agent-based modeling or social network analysis, you need some experts, or you need some adapted versions that people can trial. So there's challenges around that. There's also challenges around the data requirements. So some of these tools do require quite significant, robust data sets. We know there are problems with data in our sector, so I think it's important to understand how we can adapt these approaches to fit what we're working with. So, concluding thoughts, I've been quite open about some of the challenges that we saw, and I think we should be open about them. We do know there's an age-old, and I'm suggesting it's a dinosaur, tension between accountability and learning. There's nothing new about that. But if we're talking about innovating in M&E, I think that this tension comes up again. A lot of the tools I've been discussing here push the dynamic of monitoring and evaluation towards learning. So I think we need to be cognizant of that. And if we're trialing these kinds of approaches, we need to be serious about what it means for accountability. So there's that tension to be addressed. And secondly, it's a challenge or an opportunity, because really we're talking about a lot of tools here that encourage informal reflection and learning. So we need to be ready for that. We need to be able to have the time and space to do that, and we need to reward it in our organizational structures. But also we should see that as an opportunity, because it allows us to move beyond the formalized reporting process that I was talking about, and it also allows us to bridge the gap between this formal and informal learning systems. And lastly, I think there's a challenge around investment. So time, money, and skill sets as well. These are new tools, and just as we've, I think, over the last decade, improved the way that we do M&E and improved the investment in it, both in human and financial resources, if we're going to innovate again, then I think it's also going to require an additional investment. Nevertheless, I think these challenges are worth overcoming, because I think it's fair to say that expectations on M&E systems are starting to move, and if we don't want to innovate, if we want to continue doing as we currently are, then I think we're going to face continued questions about the usability of our work. So that's my very brief run through of a succinct report, I think it's fair to say. I really would encourage all of you to go and take a look at the report and download for further information on the details and the examples that I've outlined.